Hey everyone, Kristen from Maybe a Better One and Knits here today to share with you my top 5 tips for better fitting sweaters. I'm sure I don't have to tell you how utterly disheartening it is to spend hours and hours, 40, 50 hours knitting a sweater that ultimately doesn't fit. Nobody wants to do this, and the good news is that there are ways to avoid it. So today we are going to go through my 5 best tips for ensuring that your sweaters fit. And let's jump right in with tip number 1, which is to measure yourself. If you're familiar with sweater knitting, you know that most sweater sizes are based on a bust measurement, but there are a lot of other things that you need to measure to make sure that your sweater is going to fit, not just your bust. If you head over to the Craft Yarn Council website, you can find their standards for sweaters, for knitting designs. A lot of designers use these standards. There are some other standards out there. These are probably the most widely used though, and this will give you an idea of all of the different measurements that may be taken into account when designing a sweater pattern. And those are the things that you should measure. So at a minimum, you want to measure your bust, waist, hips. You may need to do a lower hip, which is kind of around the fullest part of your butt measurement if it is a longer sweater design, or of a tunic length. Also upper arm circumference, yoke depth. This can be a little tricky to measure, but basically you want to measure from the high point of your shoulder, and there's a bone right there, down to your underarm. That measurement, and your cross shoulder width as well, which is again from this kind of bone that is right here to the one on the other side. That is your cross shoulder width. You want to measure that as well. So lots of different things to measure, not just your bust measure, not just your bust measurements. There are some other things that maybe you want to measure. They're not as essential because they're a little easier to fix. So for example, the sleeve length from underarm to your wrist. Usually that's pretty easy to adjust if yours are longer or shorter. Also, you may want to measure, you'll notice that they don't have on this website a measurement from the underarm down to the hip, because that is not how it is measured. It is actually measured from this sort of bone right at the top of your spine, down to where your waist is. This is called the back waist length. And so patterns will use that as a jumping off point and add a certain number of inches depending on how long the total measurement they want is. So that's a little trickier, but it is worth perhaps knowing if your back waist measurement is shorter or longer than the average. All right, so after you measure yourself, what are you going to do? You are going to compare your measurements with the measurements of the sweater in the pattern. To do that, you need to take a look at the schematic. All quality sweater patterns should have a schematic. If your pattern doesn't, that is, I'm going to call that a red flag. Schematic, there should be a schematic, and it should have some basic measurements. Again, it should have bust, waist if it is different from the bust, hips if that is different from the bust. It should have an upper arm circumference and a yoke depth. It may also have back neck width, sleeve length, body length. What you want to do is find your measurements, compare them to the schematic of the finished garment. That means what the finished dimensions of the sweater would be for a given size, and see what works best for you. You do want to consider ease. I'm going to put a little link, I think it's here, could be here, but I think it's here, to my tutorial about ease and what that means. Basically, it's how tightly or loosely you want your sweater to fit. Most sweaters are worn with what is called positive ease, which means the sweater is bigger than your actual body measurements. But you're gonna go ahead and look at that schematic, look at your measurements, and see what's the best match. That doesn't mean your measurement is 36, the pattern is 36, because again, you want usually at least a little bit of ease. Not always. There are some patterns with negative ease, which is smaller than your measurements, and some with 0, which is match your measurements. But I'm gonna say at least 75% of the time you want your sweater to have some positive ease. So you're gonna look at all your measurements and find the pattern size where the measurements are the best fit for you. So that would be your measurements plus how much ease. And again, check out that other video all about ease to get a better handle on that. So the main takeaway here is don't just look at the bust measurement, compare all of your measurements. Number 3, yes, I'm sorry, you have to swatch. I recently swatched for 2 projects. And for one project, I'm gonna have to go up a needle size to get gauge. And for the other one, I'm gonna have to go down a needle size to get gauge. All designers work at a different gauge. There's no standard magic thing that happens to designers that when they start designing patterns, they all knit at the same tension. It doesn't work that way. So the gauge in your pattern is based on the gauge that your designer had when they made the pattern. And if your gauge is different, your sweater's not gonna come out the right size. So you have to swatch. You need to compare your gauge with the gauge in the pattern and adjust your needle size if necessary. And please remember that if whatever you're knitting is knit in the round, you need to also swatch in the round. Again, link here to a tutorial on how to swatch flat in the round, which is a little bit of a more efficient way to swatch in the round when you need to. But you do need to swatch and check your gauge. It's very important. Okay, so after you have measured yourself, compared, swatched, picked your size, if there are changes that need to be made, I want to encourage you to, number 4, plan ahead. Now, if you're a more experienced knitter and you need to make the sleeves a little bit longer, that's relatively easy. But if you have to do some more involved changes, rather than try to wing it, I'm going to suggest that you kind of write out a plan for what needs to be changed and how you're going to change it, and to go ahead and do the math ahead of time. That doesn't mean you have to get out like a whole Excel spreadsheet like a designer does when they are grading a pattern for different sizes, but it means that you should have that basic math ready. You know, for example, if maybe the pattern has matching bust and hips, but your hips are a little wider, and so you want to widen the body of your sweater, go ahead and do that math ahead of time and get it planned out rather than just trying to wing it. Again, as you gain more experience as a knitter and in knitting sweaters, you may be able to do the wing it thing a little more successfully. But especially in the beginning, go ahead, make your plans ahead of time. Note what has to be changed, how you are going to change it, and if there's math involved, do the math ahead of time so you're ready. And my last tip for better fitting sweaters is that you have to make peace with frogging and ripping back and redoing things. Especially if you don't follow tip number 4 and plan ahead. It's very tempting to, once you have put the work in, just kind of plow ahead because you want to get your project done. But that is how we end up with sweaters that don't fit, because we're not listening to that little voice inside our head that's saying, no, this isn't right, this isn't working, this doesn't look right, I think I made a mistake, I don't think it's gonna fit right, it doesn't look big enough, or it looks too big. That voice is there for a reason. And as much as it sucks to have to rip things out or frog or start over, it is a part of knitting sometimes. And it is, I can say from experience, definitely a part of designing. So we all get kind of wrapped up in that kind of sunk cost fallacy. Well, I've already spent so much time, and if I rip back, then I've wasted that time. But you haven't, because you have learned something from it. You've got to practice your knitting skills. And if that time that you spent ultimately results in a sweater that doesn't fit, you know, who's the loser in the end here? It's still going to be you. So make your peace with having to frog and rip back and redo things. It's a part of knitting. It is a learning experience, and ultimately it is going to set you up to get better fitting sweaters. So those are my top 5 tips for better fitting sweaters. If you are interested in a further exploration of sweater fit, I would encourage you to check out the link below to my e-course, Sweater Siren. This is available as an independent study year-round. It is also offered once per year live, and that will be in the summer, probably in July-ish. But definitely check that out if sweater fit and style have tripped you up in the past, and maybe you're looking for a little bit more guidance for that. Thank you so much for joining me for today's tutorial.